Oh, coffee.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to Philosophy of Cognitive Science with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So, on the course outline, this week's lectures are kind of fit under the title of Rules and Representations. But I'm actually not sure how well that captures what we're going to be talking this week. It certainly captures some aspects of what we're going to be talking about, but perhaps not all of them. So I've changed the title of this lecture and the next lecture to follow the titles of the chapter of Clarke that we'll be reading. That's, of course, Chapter 3, Patterns, Contents, and Causes. Now, if you remember where we left off last time, we continued our discussion of the Chinese room thought experiment. We also discussed similar ideas like Ned Block's China brain thought experiment, and we talked about the levels of organization that these thought experiments are pitched at. And it was during the course of this discussion that we encountered an idea that Clarke used to call microfunctionalism. And of course, we discussed the possibility of whether the right kinds of microfunctional states might give rise to intelligence and consciousness. We also examined some other criticisms of the classical or symbolic paradigm. We looked at the argument from everyday coping, which is due in large part to Hubert Dreyfus, who of course took a page from Heidegger's book when he put together this criticism. This criticism is of course based on the fact that symbol systems are much more fragile, much more brittle than human cognizers are. Our mental lives are rich and thick, and that's thanks to embodiment, situatedness, and a kind of pattern recognition capability that we have that Dreyfus doesn't think, at least symbolic AI has. We also talked about real brains and the bag of tricks. So we talked about, modularity of mind. We talked about neural reuse. Basically, the mind under this real brain and bag of tricks section is talked about as if it is not so much a general purpose cognition engine, but more like a bag of tricks or a Swiss Army knife, or perhaps even better than a Swiss Army knife. The mind might be more like a hand. So, of course, that discussion was covering all of the discussion section of Chapter 2. And today we're going to move on to Chapter 3, as I mentioned a moment ago, Patterns, Contents, and Causes. Before we do that, however, we're going to do some housekeeping in regards to your upcoming critical responses. Once we've taken care of that, we'll dive into the sketches section of Chapter 3. Here, Clarke is going to outline three different lines of thinking concerning symbol systems and the mind. We're going to go over the computational-representational kind of take on this, which is very much in line with what thinkers like Fodor or Polition say about the mind, that the mind is a symbol system, and that mentalistic discourse, or folk psychological explanations of thoughts and behavior, work because they are true, because they actually mirror the formal structure of thought, the language of thought, as Fodor would call it. But then we're also going to take a look at a different view called Eliminative Reductionism, which is due to thinkers like Paul and Patricia Churchland. They, as we're going to see, think that folk psychological talk is not very useful. It's unscientific, doesn't tell us anything true about our mental lives. We should eliminate that terminology and reduce our explanations down to a lower level of analysis, like neurological or physical level of analysis. And then we're going to look at some possible middle ground between these two positions, and that is, of course, Daniel Dennett's intentional stance. So, this is all very fun stuff that should sound familiar to most of you if you're coming from a cognitive science or a philosophy background. In any case, I'm going to try to explain each of these ideas in turn. And then next time, we will look at the points of discussion in Chapter 3. But before we do that, let's move on to a little bit of housekeeping and talk about your critical responses, which will be due, the first of which I should say, will be due soon. So on your course outline, it says that the first critical response is due on October 3rd at 11:59 p.m. on CU Learn. I have actually changed that due date. I've pushed it back a little bit to October 5th at 11:59 p.m. So let's see, that is Monday at 11:59 p.m., just before midnight. So you'll have a little bit of extra time to do this because it is going to be the first response. I may push back other deadlines as well, just so that everything's kind of in line with this deadline, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do that just yet. So stay tuned to the announcement forums on CU Learn. I will post future updates there. In any case, your critical response, well, let's talk about things that absolutely needs to have that are simple and easy to do. You definitely need a title. You need to include all of your student information, the course information. So, name, student number, course code, due date. You should have page numbers. You're going to need a references section too. As far as the actual style, the format of your document and the citation style you use, I'm not really picky. I just want you to keep it consistent. In any case, your response should be 500 words in length, thereabouts. You can go a little bit over or a little bit under, but not substantially so. I would not go under the word limit by more than 50 words, because I will start to dock marks at that point. Similarly, I would not recommend going over the word limit by any more than 100 words. Or, again, I'm going to start docking marks. The reason why is because part of the reason I'm having you do this is because it's important to be able to analyze and critique and explore ideas as efficiently as possible, as concisely as possible, by saying as little as you have to, while still getting your point across and communicating that to the reader. So this is going to be an exercise in doing that. So do not go substantially over or under the word limit here. And if you're not sure about how to cite your sources, I've got a link here on slide number 4 that you can take, or rather that will take you to Purdue University's online writing lab, or Purdue's OWL. On Purdue's OWL, you will find all kinds of different citation styles, APA, MLA, Chicago, Harvard, all kinds. So there should be no excuses for not citing sources properly. You need a references page with any sources you use, which might just be Clark's Mindware, or maybe you'll do some supplementary readings and cite other sources. But whatever you do, whatever you cite has to be in the references section, and it has to have in-text citations if you're directly quoting. I don't care what citation style you use, but you need to use one if you cite anything. And you do have to cite things for these critical responses. The idea you choose to discuss is drawn from the text or from my lectures, and that has to be cited. So please take care to cite your sources properly. All of the information on how to do so you can find on Purdue's OWL. So don't ask me how to cite sources. You can find all of the information there, okay? Now your task for this response and for future responses is to identify an idea that you find interesting from the lectures or from the readings and engage with it critically. And I cannot stress this enough. It is not enough for you to simply summarize an idea, okay? So if you decide to write about Turing machines, for example, you cannot just tell me what a Turing machine is, how it works, why Alan Turing came up with that. It is not enough to simply be descriptive here. You have to engage with the material critically. So what I suggest you do is identify a question that perhaps has come up. Perhaps you've been reading the materials or watching my lectures and an interesting question has occurred to you. You can explore that question and try to answer it in these critical responses. Or you can raise an issue that you disagree with and explain why you disagree with it. Perhaps you think that the physical symbol system hypothesis is wrong. Symbol systems don't have the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action. Okay, tell me why you think that. It doesn't have to be like an essay, but you should spell out why you disagree with this idea and perhaps how you might develop your argument in the future, perhaps in essay format, because these critical responses are great ways to come up with ideas for essays. Similarly, you can raise an issue that you agree with and tell me why you agree with it. Perhaps tell me why you think why the physical symbol system hypothesis is true. Or tell me why you agree with John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, for example, right? So any number of things like that. You might explain or critique a concept or thought experiment, by the way. So this goes for symbol systems, Turing machines, the Chinese room, the language of thought. There's many key concepts and ideas we've encountered so far, just within the first 2 chapters, and that we will encounter in the 3rd chapter in this week's lectures. So you can explain it and critique it. But the point is, whatever you do, you have to engage with the ideas critically. You cannot just summarize and explain. You have to actually engage with the ideas. And the whole idea here is to get you thinking critically about the ideas we're encountering in this course and to come up with interesting possible ideas to write your essays about as well. So, if this is not clear, or if you still have any other questions, you can certainly reach out to me. You can talk to me on Discord or send me an email. But I advise getting started on this soon. So, 500 words doesn't seem like a lot, but, that's the challenge. It's not a lot of room to do this with. It's not a lot of space, word-wise, to do this kind of thing. So I recommend you try to be as precise as possible, write as clearly and concisely as possible. Read your writing out loud to yourself after you've written your draft to try to catch any grammatical errors, spelling errors, punctuation errors, awkward phrasing, run-on sentences, these kinds of things. Your writing has to be clear and concise, and this is a good way to make sure that it is. Once you've identified the topic or the idea or whatever it is you want to engage with, devote, a certain percentage, maybe half, to explanation, and then the other half to critique or argument or analysis. Okay? So tell me what you're writing about, explain it, and then critically analyze it. That's how I recommend you go about doing this. And I'll probably mark these a little bit less stringently than I will in future. That is the first critical response. I'm not going to be as tough on you, marking-wise, because it is the first one. So, don't worry too much about getting everything exactly right. Use this as a learning opportunity. You are going to be writing 5 of these after all. And of course, keep in mind that this is a good way not only to shore up your knowledge, shore up all of the knowledge that you're picking up in this class, but also to develop ideas that might work as good essay topics for your final essay. So just keep those things in mind. And again, reach out to me on Discord or by email if you have any questions. So that is it for the housekeeping stuff concerning our critical responses. Let us begin Chapter 3 proper, Patterns, Contents, and Causes. We're going to start looking, well, of course, at the classical paradigm and the work of Jerry Fodor. So this stuff should sound pretty familiar to you because it's what we've been talking about so far up to this point in the class. So let's pick it up on slide 5, where we begin talking about classical or symbolic AI, the symbolic paradigm. The kind of thing that we've stuck pretty close to throughout the first 2 chapters and the accompanying lectures. We're talking here, of course, physical symbol systems, which are formal systems realized by physical means. The physical states of the system mirror the formal computational states of the system. And of course, the symbols have content. They mean something, but the system itself is blind to the meaning, to the semantics. It operates as a syntactic engine. That is, it operates by respecting the syntactic properties within the system, albeit being blind to the semantic content of the symbols within the system. Now, the symbolic paradigm, or symbolic AI, is alluring because, well, one reason why it's very alluring is because it explains intelligent behavior. And this should be quite clear if you've been following the lectures and reading along with the book, with the readings. It's quite clear that the classical paradigm can explain intelligent behavior. That's what Newell and Simon were all about with their physical symbol system hypothesis, right? A physical symbol system has the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action, if you remember. But the symbolic paradigm is also alluring because it accounts for the explanatory powers of mentalistic discourse. That is what I have called previously in some of my lectures folk psychology. We've encountered this before, as I just mentioned. Folk psychological discourse, according to somebody like Zenon Polishin or Jerry Fodor, works because it's true, right? Folk psychological discourse, which is of course attributing mental states to people. Mental states include things like beliefs and desires, things that we often call propositional attitudes or pro-attitudes. This works positing these mental states and explaining behavior by reference to these mental states and transitions between these mental states. Works because it's true, because there really are such mental states. Folk psychology is true and powerful, according to a thinker like Fodor or Polishin, because it is an accurate way of describing the inner workings of minds, not just artificial minds, but our minds as well. So, on Fodor's account, or on Polishin's account, mental agents really do possess mental states, that is, propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires, and these have real causal powers. They are real mental states with real causal powers. This is a position called intentional realism. Intentional realism is just the view that propositional attitudes, or what we call propositional attitudes, accurately capture these mental states, and that these mental states have causal power. And Fodor sees this power of folk psychology, as a scientific vindication of folk psychology. That is, he sees, as well as Polishin, they both see that the power of folk psychology to explain other people's behavior and to explain other people's thoughts and actions is a kind of vindication of the truth of folk psychology. Now, I've talked about propositional attitudes a little bit here. I've mentioned propositional attitudes previously in the course, but I haven't really gone into a great amount of detail about what these are. So I thought I would do that before we proceed. So, what is a propositional attitude? Well, to understand what a propositional attitude is, we first have to be clear about what a proposition is. Now, propositions, again, this is going back to what Clark talked about in Chapter 1 with regard to the contributions of logic to cognitive science. In logic, we have propositions. Propositions are statements about the world. And the world is, what is the case, okay? It's not just the world of objects or things, to kind of paraphrase Wittgenstein. The world is the world of facts, okay? The world is what is the case. And propositions are statements about the world. So, propositions have a truth value. That is, propositions are statements about the world that can be true or false. So, for example, on slide number 6, I've given the example, it is raining. Same example that Clark uses. It is raining is a proposition. It is a statement about the world, and it can be true or false. Right now, it is false, because as I record this video, it is not, in fact, raining where I am. So, that's a proposition. Propositional attitudes are attitudes that we take toward propositions. And attitudes here mean mental states like belief or desire, hopes, fears, any kind of mental state. It's a kind of attitude, again, that we take toward a proposition, specifically the truth of the proposition. So, for example, Josh believes that it is raining expresses a propositional attitude, namely my belief that the proposition it is raining is true. Propositional attitudes, by the way, are usually expressed by a that clause. So, Josh believes, that's the attitude, that it is raining, that's the proposition. And altogether, that expresses the propositional attitude. And these propositional attitudes, these mental states interact with one another, they generate behavior, and so on and so forth. And there are many different names for this kind of thing. Sometimes it's called folk psychology. That's the terminology I tend to use. Sometimes it's called common sense psychology. Sometimes it's called propositional attitude psychology. Sometimes it's called belief desire psychology. It's all describing the same kind of thing, though. So let's say there's an agent, a thinking agent. Me, Josh, your instructor. I'm a thinking agent. And let's say I'm thirsty. Okay, so there are various physiological processes going on that cause me to feel thirsty. So you could say that I have this perceptual belief that I am thirsty. I feel thirsty, so I'm thirsty. And I form a desire to have a drink to satisfy my thirst. And I also believe that there's beer in the fridge. So I have a few beliefs here. I have a belief that I am thirsty, a desire to satisfy that thirst, a belief that there is beer in the fridge. And these all interact and cause me to form an instrumental desire to get up and walk to the fridge and open it, because I believe there's beer in the fridge. And I further believe that by drinking a beer, I will not be thirsty anymore. And since I desire not to be thirsty, I form this chain of beliefs and desires. I use instrumental reasoning to generate my behavior. And if I were to watch someone else doing the same thing, say, sighing because they appear thirsty and getting up and going to the fridge, I could understand their behaviors in the same kind of way. I could say, well, they're making noises like, oh, I'm so thirsty. They're getting up and going to the fridge, opening it, taking a beverage out of the fridge and drinking it, and releasing this sigh of satisfaction, perhaps. So that person obviously had a desire to satisfy their thirst and believed that by getting up and going to the fridge and taking a drink out and drinking it, they could satisfy their thirst. Because of this power that folk psychological or daily mental discourse type explanations have for explaining our own behavior and the behavior of others, Fodor sees that as a scientific vindication of folk psychological reasoning. And this is all captured in what Clark and others call the representational theory of mind, or sometimes the computational representational theory of mind. Basically, this says that propositional attitudes pick out computational relations to internal representations, and that mental processes are causal processes that involve transitions between these internal representations. So what we call these propositional attitudes or pro-attitudes pick out actual inner mental states, inner symbol structures, internal representations. And these are causal, so that the transition between states, between mental states, which the transition between steps in this folk psychological practical reasoning chain pick out, they actually pick out something that identifies, that matches up with these internal states. Much like a computer, much like how the internal syntactic yet semantically blind transitions between states, transitions from one symbol structure to the next, mirror the formal structure of the computation. So it's the same thing going in the mind, according to Fodor. And of course, Fodor thinks this happens in a kind of language of thought, a formal system that we think with. Now, before, I did talk a little bit about the language of thought hypothesis. Of course, just to reiterate that very quickly, that is Fodor's idea that we have this internal formal language we think in. It's a symbolic language, and it explains how we think. Now, Fodor has raised some concerns about this in recent years, prior to his death, which you can read about in Box 3.1, The Language of Thought Revisited. He does raise concerns that the representational theory of mind, computational theory of mind, language of thought sort of thing, which all fits very nicely under the symbolic paradigm, is an incomplete explanation of the mind. Why? Well, it all concerns the way in which these symbol systems satisfy one constraint, or demand, I should say, which is compositionality, at the expense of satisfying another demand, globality. So what is compositionality? Well, compositionality with respect to symbol systems means that symbol systems have semantic structures such that we can build more complicated symbol structures from simpler ones. You know, we can build cat's meow from cat and meow, or dog's bark from dog and bark. We can build, thinking back to the physical symbol system hypothesis, we can build complicated expressions, more complicated symbol structures out of simpler symbols. So our expressions might be like words or whole sentences, but our symbols are like letters in an alphabet, right? So symbol systems have this property of compositionality. So the physical symbol system hypothesis and the computational-representational theory of mind, or language of thought, have this property. They have compositionality. But what they don't have is globality. And globality is this property or characteristic where mental properties must be sensitive to global properties in the system. They can't just be local. They have to be related to global beliefs. Here you might think of something like the frame problem, right? I haven't really talked about the frame problem in too much detail here, but the frame problem is basically the problem of determining what beliefs are relevant to solving a problem, or what axioms in the system are relevant to which computation, so on and so forth. We seem to be global systems. Human beings seem global. We can easily work out the kinds of beliefs or desires that might be relevant to solving some problem, thanks to instrumental reasoning, right? But computers run into the frame problem where they quickly end up in a combinatorial explosion because of the problem of trying to, I guess, brute force their way through a problem, a specific problem. They run out of computational resources. Problems become computationally intractable because we haven't quite solved this frame problem, at least when it comes to artificial cognitive systems. So a human being knows what beliefs will be relevant to addressing a particular problem. But artificial cognitive systems, particularly symbolic ones, are kind of bad at this. Now, Fodor thinks that the right kind of processing needs to be what Clark calls suprasyntactic. But it isn't clear. It isn't clear how processing that only sees local syntactic structure will achieve this global kind of semantic this semantic globality that mental agents like real humans seem to have. So that is a problem. And this leads to what isn't really talked about in this textbook, but what is known as Fodor's first law of the non-existence of cognitive science. And that is that this symbolic language of thought kind of thing doesn't really seem to do all that good of a job at explaining central domain general cognition. In other words, there's not really that much for cognitive scientists to study if Fodor is right about this. So, geez, I've kind of gone here and there and over here with this discussion. But anyway, I guess all this is just to say that the view that we've been considering so far, the classical paradigm or the symbolic paradigm, or what Fodor would call the representational theory of mind / language of thought / computational theory of mind, is as follows. We have a symbol system. The symbols can combine symbol structures, very much in line with the physical symbol system hypothesis. Our mentalistic discourse, our folk psychological discourse, mirrors the states and transitions between states of this system. Fodor calls this system the language of thought, but there are problems. It's compositional, but it's not global. We run into problems like the frame problem when we build artificial cognitive systems, which we do not seem to face. So that is the argument of Fodor. And Fodor thinks that even though this might be incomplete, folk psychological discourse maps onto real internal states and transitions between those states, and that's why it works. And this serves as a scientific vindication of folk psychological discourse, or common sense mentalistic discourse. But there's a problem. There might not be the kinds of symbolic inner states that Fodor thinks vindicates folk psychology. And here's where we turn to the ideas of the Churchlands, in particular Paul Churchland. So let us turn to this now. All right, so now we're picking it up from slide number 8, where we read about the position of Paul Churchland. Now, Paul and Patricia Churchland are renowned as neurophilosophers. They're philosophers, but they pay very close attention to the implementational details of cognition. They're also well known as eliminative reductionists, and we'll see what that means as we proceed. But basically, Paul Churchland is arguing here that common sense psychology, or folk psychology, is quasi-scientific. Fodor thinks it's scientifically vindicated, but the Churchlands disagree. They think it is, quote, superficial, distortive, and false, both in spirit and in detail. And here I'm quoting from Clark, page 50. Now, before I go any further in this discussion, let's take a look at box 3.2, Common Sense Psychology. What is called common sense psychology in box 2 is what I've been calling folk psychology, and again, you can call it any number of other things. Belief, desire psychology, what have you, right? Doesn't really matter. The point is, it's all about combining attitudes with propositions, and usually these are stuck together in a that clause, right? Like, Josh believes that it is raining, or Sarah believes that it will rain tomorrow. These are propositional attitudes, or rather they are sentences that express propositional attitudes. The idea in a symbolic account is that there are sentences that express such attitudes, symbolic sentences of course, in a kind of language of thought. This is what thinkers like Fodor or Polition are arguing. Now, why do we say this is a theory, or theory-like? This is important. We often say that folk psychology works like a theory, but what does that mean? Well, we say this because folk psychology, some people say, like Fodor, explains behavior. Now, this is pretty key. Explanations presuppose laws, regularities in nature that we can discover. And theories, in the scientific sense, are like big collections of laws or big frameworks that kind of fit all these laws together in a coherent, explanatory picture. They help us explain the world. They help us offer predictions about the world in the form of these law-like generalizations. So, take for example the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is a theory, but one element of the theory of evolution is the law of natural selection. Okay, so the law of natural selection is a part of the theory of evolution, and the theory of evolution can be used to make predictions that we can go out and test. There's, I can't remember the name, maybe it was Haldane who said, what would falsify the theory of evolution? A fossil rabbit in the Precambrian, right? That would falsify it. So, you know, there's law-like generalizations that we can use to try and falsify our theories. But the point is that theories are these collections of laws. Theories explain, and they do that because they presuppose laws, and they allow us to form these law-like generalizations. So why is folk psychology said to be a theory? Well, we implicitly seem to accept generalizations like this as explanations of people's behavior. Why did he go to the fridge? He was thirsty. Why did she rage quit the video game? She was angry because she did not beat the video game. Couldn't beat the final boss, right? So this is like, this kind of thing is like a law-like generalization that we use in folk psychological thinking or daily mentalistic discourse or common sense psychology, whatever you want to call it, to explain people's behavior. And if this is true, and thinkers like Fodor or Polition would argue that it is, then folk psychology is indeed a theory. In fact, it is often treated as a theory of mind in philosophy of mind and the cognitive sciences. So, with all of that being said, why does Churchland argue that folk psychology is inadequate? Well, there are three reasons that Clark outlines. The first reason is that it works in a limited domain. That is, it only seems to work for some aspects of quote-unquote normal human agents. A second reason is that folk psychology's origins and evolution give us cause for concern. And a third reason is that folk psychology does not seem to fit, so Churchland argues, with the rest of our scientific picture of ourselves. So let's break each of these down in a little bit more detail. As for point number one, what kind of things does folk psychology not explain, according to Churchland? Well, it doesn't explain things like sleep. It doesn't explain things like creativity. It doesn't explain mental illness. It doesn't explain other kinds of cognition, like infant cognition or non-human animal cognition. I mean, just think about that. Animals are obviously thinking agents, but they don't have language. And we talk about our propositional attitudes, our belief, desire, psychology, in natural language. You know, I believe that P, so I formed the desire to Q, right? Animals don't do that, yet animals think. So what good is folk psychology for animals or infants or the mentally ill, right? As far as number two, folk theories are generally considered unscientific and unreliable, right? We all have a kind of folk physics, right? We kind of have a knack for predicting how objects will behave in the world. If I throw you a ball, you can probably catch it, even if you're not very good at catching things. Because you know how objects in the world behave. You know that balls thrown will eventually go down and land on the ground. You know that solid objects don't pass through one another. That's like a folk physics. But that doesn't tell us how the world really works like, you know, actual physics does. It doesn't tell us about the properties of matter and energy and these kinds of things. So it's not scientific and it's not reliable. You can use your folk physics if you want to play a game of baseball. You cannot use your folk physics if you want to build a rocket to go to the moon. And if you want to compare further examples, just compare, you know, older sciences that have fallen out of favor that were rampant with this kind of folk reasoning. Compare astrology to astronomy, for example, or compare alchemy to chemistry, right? There are any number of examples. So that's it for point number two. Its origins and evolution give us cause for concern. As for point number three, Churchland thinks that there is no way to systematically translate folk psychology to a more fundamental science, like neuroscience, or more fundamentally to physics. And it is in point number three that Clark thinks that Churchland's argument, or his skepticism, excuse me, really shows the most. Now, Churchland seems to agree with Fodor that folk psychology needs scientific vindication. He just doesn't think it's going to happen. Fodor thinks it's a done deal. Churchland disagrees. What we would need here is a discovery of mental items, some kind of internal symbol structures that share their content and structure with folk psychology, with propositional attitudes and transitions between the mental states that we talk about in our mentalistic discourse. Churchland doesn't think that that's happened, and of course Churchland is influenced very much by neuroscience and the connectionist paradigm, which we have not looked at yet. We'll look at it next week, but the point is, for now, Churchland does not think there is any internal, symbolic mental item, any kind of internal symbol structure that's going to precisely match up with the content and structure of beliefs and desires in our folk psychology. So, because we can't reduce folk psychology to the neurophysiology, to what's going on in the brain, we ought to eliminate folk psychology. Folk psychological terms, according to the Churchlands, need to go the way of things like phlogiston, the ether, the philosopher's stone, of crystal spheres in the heavens. These are things that turn out not to exist. They're concepts that don't map on to anything out there in the world. So we got rid of them and we came up with new terms and theoretical entities to explain how the world works, to explain how the planets orbit the sun and how matter and energy work and so forth. They say something very similar about folk psychology. Beliefs and desires are just not good theoretical terms. They don't capture what's going on in the mind. So let's get rid of them and let's just focus on what's going on in the brain at the implementational level. Thus, the Churchlands are eliminative materialists or eliminative reductionists. So, okay, those are two options. One seems very familiar and perhaps a little bit comfortable, right? Folk psychology is vindicated because it works. Our minds really are physical symbol systems. We think in a kind of language of thought, and our folk psychological or mentalistic discourse accurately captures the content and structure of that symbol system, of the language of thought. That's what Fodor and Polition would argue. On the other hand, you have the Churchlands who say, well, no, they don't really map on to whatever's going on in the mind. There are no inner states that correspond to beliefs and desires, so we need to get rid of folk psychological thinking. These are like two different ends of a spectrum here. But what if there's another option? Well, if you're Daniel Dennett, or a follower of Daniel Dennett's work, you'll think that there is another way, in fact. And to try to appreciate this, we're going to read a little story, quoted in Clark, from Dennett's book, The Intentional Stance. Dennett writes, suppose, for the sake of drama, that it turns out that the subpersonal cognitive psychology, the inner cognitive organization, of some people turns out to be dramatically different from that of others. One can imagine the newspaper headlines. Scientists prove most left-handers incapable of belief. Or, startling discovery, diabetics have no desires. But this is not what we would say, no matter how the science turns out. And our reluctance would not be just conceptual conservatism, but the recognition of an obvious empirical fact. For let left and right-handers, or men and women, or any other subset of people, be as internally different as you like. We already know that there are reliable, robust patterns in which all behaviorally normal people participate. The patterns we traditionally describe in terms of belief and desire, and the other terms of folk psychology. So what is Dennett saying there? Well, essentially that even if there are no inner structures that match our folk psychological apparatus, folk psychology still captures something true about the way we all behave and the way we think. So maybe we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Before we go any further, though, we need to make a distinction. We need to distinguish between two different kinds of questions, and this is something that Dennett is always very careful to do. We can distinguish between empirical or scientific questions and conceptual or philosophical questions. Here, with regard to folk psychology, the scientific questions are questions like, why does common sense mental talk work for us? But a conceptual or philosophical question might be, what must be the case if such explanations are to be good, proper, and true for humans and for other types of thinking beings, like aliens or non-human animals or robots? Now, the little story that I read from Dennett, quoted in Clark on page 52, is meant to highlight the difference between these two questions. Maybe we'll find out that men and women, or diabetics, or left-handed versus right-handed people have some kind of different inner mental symbol structure, right? That doesn't matter. That's an empirical question that doesn't really bear on the conceptual question. What must be the case if these explanations are to be good, proper, and true? And this gets us to a further question, which is also to be found on Clark, page 52. What determines membership in the class of beings that are properly described using the apparatus of folk psychology or daily mentalistic discourse? Well, again, let's go back to this difference between the scientific and empirical and the conceptual or philosophical. Membership in some classes is definitely scientifically determined, right? Clark uses the example of membership in the class gases. So we have this class of gases. What makes something a gas? It has to fulfill a certain criterion, and we've identified that criterion empirically, and we can tell whether something is a member of that class by, going out and looking at it empirically. Again, so what determines membership in the class gases? Indefinite expansion at ordinary temperatures, so on and so forth, right? So gases behave in certain ways. We've discovered how they behave empirically, and when we want to classify new things as gases, we check whether they behave in the right kinds of ways. But not all kinds of things are like that. What about a class like charitable acts? That's not scientifically determined. What counts as a charitable act is not something we go out and check with an experiment or with observation. It's something that is more conceptual. We might come up with the necessary and sufficient conditions to count as a charitable act, for example, instead of going and doing an experiment. That's the difference. So, what about the class that is properly described by daily mentalistic discourse? Well, Fodor and Churchland, just to go back for a second, both think that class membership here is determined by facts about the inner organization of whatever kind of being or system we're talking about. That is, about how relations between different inner states and between inner states and outer states are fixed. So Fodor thinks that transitions between inner states, that takes place in a language of thought, and that this is kind of perhaps grounded in the environment, although I'm not sure if Fodor ever really made a lot of arguments to that end. And Churchland thinks the same kind of thing. To be a thinking thing requires the right kinds of states in the brain, right? This is identity theory. So they disagree about the kinds of states, but they both agree that this is what determines class membership of, thinking agents. But a different kind of answer to this question might depend upon behavior patterns. Regardless about the facts concerning the causes of behavior or the inner states and their relations to one another and how those relations are fixed, or how the relations between the internal states of the system and external states in the world are fixed. And this kind of answer, the answer that depends upon behavior patterns, is the kind of answer that Dennett is offering. So when we use folk psychology to try to understand or explain or predict behavior, what we're doing, according to Dennett, is adopting something he calls the intentional stance. What is the intentional stance? Well, it's a stance we take where we treat the system in question as if it were making intelligent choices in line with beliefs and desires and the other items from our folk psychological apparatus. We treat it as what Dennett calls a true believer, a system whose behavior is reliably predictable using the intentional stance or the intentional strategy. And we don't just do this for other thinking things like other people or animals. We do this for inanimate objects, and we do this for natural phenomena as well. In the intentional stance, Dennett's book, he uses the example of, well, I should preface this by saying that Dennett lives on this farm and makes apple cider and does all kinds of farmy things on his farm. And he was having a lightning rod installed so that lightning would hit the rod and go down to the ground and be dispersed in the ground rather than damaging anything in the building. And the guy who's installing his lightning rod is explaining in terms of the intentional stance, like, the lightning wants to get to the ground. Of course, the lightning doesn't want anything, but we can reliably predict the behavior of lightning using the intentional stance. It wants to get to the ground as fast as it can. So we'll put up this nice lightning rod that's conductive, it's made of metal, and the lightning will strike that and it'll get to the ground. It'll get to where it wants to go. We do this with inanimate objects too. We could say my car needs gasoline. Of course, cars don't need gasoline like humans need coffee, but we can reliably predict the behavior of our motor vehicle by adopting an intentional strategy this way. Of course, all the systems that we apply the strategy to are systems that are well-designed systems. They behave in ways that make sense. They're not random. Clark uses a simple example here of a well-designed system, a creature called a den, which we can imagine that lives in a simple environment, and it's evolved color vision, and it eats these little food particles, which are green, and it avoids these poison particles that are yellow, and we can explain this using an intentional strategy. It's a well-designed system. Even though it's very different from us, it's much simpler than us, but we can say, oh, our den wants to move toward the little green food particles and eat them, and it wants to avoid the yellow poison particles, or it will die. So it's a very different kind of system than we are, but it's a well-designed system. It behaves in ways that make sense. It behaves in non-random ways. So we can apply the intentional strategy here, and we can make sense of our den's behavior using the intentional stance. The intentional stance is actually a special case of something that Dennett calls the design stance. There are a number of different stances that Dennett gives. There's the physical stance, the design stance, and finally the intentional stance. But we're not going to get into all of that in great detail here. The important thing is just to keep in mind that the intentional stance is a special case of the design stance. And the design stance is a stance we take where we understand objects by reference to what they are supposed to do. So the intentional stance kind of takes the design stance and adds this requirement that the system is not only well-designed, but it's also rational. Now, when it comes to well-designed systems, I need to emphasize that Dennett is not talking about some kind of intelligent design. Dennett is talking about things that have been designed by natural selection, by evolution, by the blind watchmaker, as it were. And indeed, Dennett makes this quite clear, but I just want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding here. Dennett is talking about things that have been designed by evolution, and of course, evolution cannot produce a perfect cognizer. We face constraints, time constraints, computational constraints. The world is dynamic and messy, and sometimes we get things wrong. our brain kind of evolved to do the best it can with limited resources. So to go back to our example of our den creature, maybe it'll mistake food particles for poison particles. At a certain angle, green appears yellow to our creature and yellow appears green. So our den might mistake food particles for poison particles and vice versa. But we could still try and predict its behavior, but the predictions we make using the intentional stance would fail under these specific circumstances where green appears yellow and yellow appears green to our den creature. So the intentional stance is just a tool or a strategy. It will fail when there is a flaw in the design, or when the hardware fails, or where the environment is too messy for the system to cope with it. So, it's not perfect. As Dennett says, it has evolved because it works, and it works because we have evolved. But evolution is not perfect. The designs that evolution produces are not really all that intelligent. But they work well enough, given 4 billion years of time. So, for Dennett, being a believer is just a matter of being a creature whose behavior can be understood and explained using the intentional stance. So, a robot could be a believer, even though its inner states might not be anything like our own. Let's say that the Churchlands are right, for example. We don't have internal symbol structures that mirror the structure of our folk psychological apparatus. We don't have anything in the mind that we could really call a belief or a desire. We just have different neural firing patterns and stuff like that. But we can still talk about ourselves in terms of beliefs and desires. We could do the same with a robot that perhaps has a classic symbol system, like Shaky the robot. We could explain the behavior of the robot using the intentional stance, even though its inner states are nothing like our inner states. Indeed, for Daniel Dennett, the inner states don't really matter when it comes to applying the intentional stance. It's all about the patterns of behavior. Thus, being a believer, a system that we can understand using the intentional stance, is of course stance dependent. But it's important to emphasize here that Dennett is not saying that being a believer, that is, being able to use, being the kind of thing that we can explain behavior, explain the behavior of, that is, in terms of folk psychology, this is not merely in the eye of the beholder. Rather, the intentional stance works because there are real, actual, objective patterns in human and animal behavior. Indeed, in the patterns of all well-designed, reasonable systems that are observer-independent. And this is another thing that Dennett was trying to get at with his story about, people without beliefs and desires and so forth. Now, these patterns of behavior, according to Dennett, are only discernible using a mentalistic perspective. So, being a believer, or being an intentional system, is not in the eye of the beholder. The relevant patterns of behavior are objective and they are observer independent. But Dennett does warn of the quote-unquote misplaced concreteness of beliefs. Dennett does not outright deny the existence of some inner code like the language of thought or some kind of symbol system in the mind that precisely maps onto our folk psychological apparatus. He doesn't outright reject that like Paul Churchland does. But, on the other hand, he doesn't think that mentalistic talk requires the existence of discrete inner mental items like particular beliefs and desires and so forth. So, common sense mentalistic discourse, therefore, is not concrete. Rather, it is abstract. Beliefs and desires are what Dennett calls abstracta. So, beliefs and desires, things from our folk psychological apparatus, are more like centers of gravity or the equator, right? They exist in the abstract. They are real. They're not extended in space and time, but they are real. They're actually existing things, just in the abstract. They're not concrete things. And what Dennett is trying to get at here is that the concreta in the brain, the symbol structures, the sentences in the language of thought, the neural firing patterns, or whatever, will probably not perfectly match up with the abstracta that we use to explain thoughts and behaviors. The abstracta being the tools of common sense, folk psychological, mentalistic discourse, like beliefs and desires. So, that's about it for today. Let's try and tie all of this up together before we end off for this lecture. All right, so we've covered the sketches section from chapter 3. We started with the computational representational theory of mind and language of thought, which of course is due to thinkers like Fodor and Polition. And Fodor thinks that folk psychology is scientifically vindicated because it works. He further thinks that our folk psychological apparatus works because it matches the inner symbols and the transitions between different states from one symbol structure to another, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we've seen that eliminative materialists, like for example Paul Churchland, thinks that we should abandon our folk psychological apparatus. There are no such symbol structures in the brain, at least if there are, they don't mesh nicely with our folk psychological apparatus. They don't map onto that apparatus. So we should get rid of concepts like beliefs and desires. These are more like pseudoscientific terms that we've abandoned, like phlogiston or the luminiferous ether, rather than scientific concepts. So we need to get rid of them and just focus on brain states. And of course, we have our kind of middle ground. That is the intentional stance, which is due to Daniel Dennett. Inner symbols probably won't align directly with our folk psychological apparatus, but that's okay. What matters is not the concreta in the brain. What matters are the abstracta, the observer-independent patterns of behavior that we can identify by treating well-designed, reason-respecting systems as such. That is, by applying the intentional stance. So for Dennett, mentalistic discourse does pick out something real. It's just abstract. It's not concrete like Fodor thinks it is. So that is it for today. For our next lecture, we will turn to the discussion section of Chapter 3. And in the meantime, if you have any questions at all about your upcoming critical responses, please do let me know. I've also shared all of the details I've discussed in this lecture on CU Learn, and I will be posting the submission portal shortly. Again, it will be due at 11:59 p.m. on October 5th, but the portal will be open so that if you're finished before then, you can hand it in a few days early. Anyway, that is all. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all digesting this material well enough. But if you have any questions, don't be shy about getting in touch. Okay? So I will see you all on Thursday for our next lecture. Bye for now.